could go back to our title slide so people can see. Today's webinar, as I mentioned, is sponsored by XebiaLabs, and it's a live virtual panel, and it's starting a DevOps and Continuous Delivery transformation in the enterprise. And it is a all-star panel, and if we can move on to our next speaker, or our next slide, I'm sorry. Our all-star panel today is, well, first of all, I think every one of these have appeared on our webinars before. We're going to start off with a good friend, Gary Gruver, who, along with another panel member, Tommy Mouser, have written a great book that we featured on DevOps.com earlier called Leading the Transformation. And both of these gentlemen have a ton of experience as leaders in leading organizations through DevOps transformations and IT transformations. And they're joined by another multi-time guest on our webinar series, Andrew Phillips, VP over at Xebia. Gentlemen, welcome to today's panel.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
Andrew, Tommy, you're both on?
Yes, we're here. Good morning.
Okay.
We should be here and happy to go.
Just always making sure that the darn thing's working, right? You know how technology is.
Right.
Anyway, guys, without further ado, let me turn it over to you all to handle this, and we can go from there. Hello.
So maybe if we take it from one of the first questions, Alan, remind me, were you going to read the questions, or were we going to?
Oh, okay. My fault, guys. I do apologize. I was getting right into the slides instead of jumping on it. Okay. Okay, just bear with us here because I have to switch screens on my end, and my fault, I had shut it down because it was making noises. Okay. And if I get noises from other programs, I do apologize. So our first question, and really let's start it off with Gary, is why do you think it is important that executives engage in leading the change, and how do you get them to engage?
You know, I think it's important if you've got a large organization that's got a tightly coupled architecture that they get involved in leading the change, because what you're trying to do is figure out how to release code on a more frequent basis while maintaining stability, reliability, performance, and all those other things. And you can't have some teams choose to do it and some teams not choose to do it if they're in a tightly coupled system. Now, if you're not in a tightly coupled system that requires larger groups of people to work together to develop, qualify, and deploy code, then I think you can kind of empower the teams and let them go. But that's just not what I see in most of the companies that I work with. They have legacy systems that are tightly coupled, and they need to coordinate the work. And as they're trying to transform, you can't have different teams doing different things. You've got to come up with a common agreement of what to do. And I think the executives are uniquely positioned, one, to muster the resources to make this happen, and two is to align the priorities and expectations across the group so they're working in a coordinated fashion. And you can do it from the bottoms up and make some change, but eventually you're going to struggle with either pushing a rope or getting some different people to engage. So if you're really going to move it forward and move forward quickly, you need that leadership defining the alignment across the organization.
Agreed. Andrew, Tommy, any comments?
No,
Yeah, I think.
Tommy, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Andrew.
No, go ahead. You first, Tommy.
No, I was just gonna, add to this that, or maybe I should say emphasize one of the things that Gary said, and that is, in a large enterprise, it is most often the case that the full system that you're trying to deliver out to your customer, is within the control of a single group of, even at the management or development level. So getting the folks at the top of the pyramid invested in this process, and being able to set those priorities, I think, is paramount to your success.
Andrew?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things that I was recently at the DevOps Enterprise Summit, looking at some of the sort of themes we were seeing from large organizations that are making the move from going from trying to do this in a couple of small projects or smaller projects to a kind of enterprise-wide initiative. A very consistent comment there was indeed that once you start to make that leap, you do need that support from the top because, well, the cost gets bigger, the changes you want to make get bigger, you're out of the skunk works phase. And I think to some extent what I certainly, from my experience, have seen is that the adoption here is not too different from the way an industry as a whole adopts a particular paradigm. You have some people who want to push the envelope, who will try out new things, who have the skills and resources locally to do that, but eventually it becomes sufficiently compelling as an argument that you want to kind of quote-unquote set it up properly, and that means putting in place the kind of, well, the organization, the budgets, and so on that allow, especially even the how should I put it, the permission to make changes to the way an organization does things, that kind of authority, and that requires the buy-in from the top.
Sure. So,
real quick, Alan, you asked one more question. One is, why is it important? The next one is, how do you get them to engage?
That's what I was going to say, Gary. Thank you.
And I think that's where, a lot of my passion and energy is it's easy for engineers to find places to go to get advice on how to do things differently. It's hard to find resources for executives to help them figure out what their role is, how to make it work, and why does it matter? And what Tommy and I tried to do is put down, the business results we think are possible, the role of the executives. It was kind of everything we wish we knew before we started doing this 8 years ago, and something that was short enough and easy enough to read that the executives would do it. And so now my goal is, I think the big step in getting the executives to engage more is trying to figure out how many people out there I can get to sort of embrace the book and read it and start thinking about it and start figuring out what their role is, because there's nothing really out there that talks to the executives right now. And what I'm struggling, my passion is, how do I help more executives? And one of the steps feels like, how do we get them to engage in the content and start to understand it a little better?
Excellent. And if I can, I'm just going to break it up a little bit even more granular, and this will lead us, I think, into our next question. And that is, I think there's two aspects to what you're talking about, Gary, and Tommy and Andrew. I think it goes without saying that to be successful, you're going to need some executive sponsorship, some executive engagement. The follow-on question is, how do you get that to happen? And there's two aspects to it. Number one, how does someone from, let's call it the top down, the bottom up, right? How does a single contributor engage these executives to convince them, right, when there may not be a plethora of information or a track record or, some sort of background? And then number two, as you bring out, Gary, if an executive says, yeah, this might be something I'd like to lead, where does he go to get educated? Where does he get his information? So there's two aspects of engaging the executives, and the first one starts, well, if you're, I don't want to say just an engineer, but how do you convince your company of the benefits of DevOps if you're starting from the bottom? In other words, we have no awareness, we have no track record or experience to go on, and how does someone who's not already an executive get an executive's attention with that? Tommy, and then maybe Gary, if you want to follow on, but let's throw that at Tommy first.
Sure. A couple of things I think come to mind in answering this type of a question. Number one is, and I've heard both Gary and Andrew mention this already, but making this type of a transformation is a big organizational change management activity. So the first thing for an engineer or even a first or middle level manager to look at is and go educate themselves on is organizational change management, right? And there are lots of good books and seminars and conferences and things that you can go get on that, right, that will teach you and you'll educate yourself on how that process works, right, and then use those tools as you learn them. But the other thing about, how do I convince an executive to do that? One thing that I often see engineers and first-level managers do is think like engineers and first-level managers, and they see this as a technical problem. And oftentimes, executives, right, have to straddle the fence of business and technology, and so they have to balance those kinds of things. So part of it is presenting this to them and presenting data to them such that they can see that there is a business value associated with this. This isn't just a technological change for the sake of technological change, but there's actually business value in this for them, and that they as an executive can be more successful if they can lead this transformation. So Gary, your thoughts on that?
Tom, I think you hit it right on. If you're going to talk to executives, don't talk to them about DevOps or Lean or Agile or any of those things. Talk to them about the business results and why it matters to your business. And I'd start with, here are what I see are the business objectives of what we could get out of a transformation. You could read the first few chapters, maybe it's chapter 4 of the book that we get into that in more detail, and frame it up and try to frame it in that terminology for them and have that type of conversation with them, and then show how the changes that you would make would have an impact on the success of the business.
Excellent. Andrew, if I can turn this question around to you a little bit, we look at the slide and we see people, process, technology. We hear Tommy and Gary talking about how to engage leadership. Andrew, where do you see sort of the role of XebiaLabs or the role of a solutions company like Xebia? How do you guys help in that, if I may ask, or how do you see it?
Well, we provide the magic to make it all happen. Obviously, no. I mean, I think seriously.
Of course.
I think, of course, yes. So what was I going to say? No, I mean, I think what we see in practice is two things. And I think the first is, almost every customer, every user we have, what we end up providing to them is not just a piece of technology. It's advice, it's best practice, it's how are other companies in my kind of situation addressing this. I mean, we're not a consulting company officially, if you like, and that's certainly not our business model, but what most of our customers benefit from to a large extent is the fact that we don't just sell them a tool and then run away going ha 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 ha. We workshop with them, we go and apply the kind of experience we've had from trying to do this in other organizations in similar industries. So to some extent there is an element of knowledge transfer here as well, of course. But technology, and I am just as much as everybody else, certainly when you talk about executive leadership, technology is not, you're not selling technology to the executive, you're selling business benefit. At the same time, the business benefit, if you look at a lot of the DevOps use cases, the challenges, of course, are usually around the culture, the process, how do we get all the people on board, and so on. But the technology usually has to evolve beyond what you have today as well. I mean, there aren't that many cases where you can pick up your existing toolkit and just by looking at it in a more smart way, with a different attitude, you can make it do all the stuff you want. I mean, a lot of the if you like, the acceleration that people are looking for, the reduction in risk, the increase in quality, requires an increase in the automation that you put into the end-to-end process, which means you have to think about the end-to-end process, of course. And so one of the things we as a solution company provide, obviously, are the tools to make that automation possible, and maybe more importantly, to make it possible in an organization where it's not just 10 rock stars who just written their own operating system or something along those lines. And I think the other thing, and this is much more interesting from an executive level, I mean, we, in our view of things, we think we provide 3 components. Automation is but one of them. It's not a trivial one, of course, but it's really only one of them. Visibility and control are the 2 others, and I think they play a much bigger role when you're talking at that higher level. Visibility in terms of not just allowing people to understand how this initiative is going and providing the feedback that shows that the changes we're making are working and we are getting better speed through our throughput or these kind of things, but also ultimately going towards a model where we can serve our customers, whether they're internal or external, better by giving them ability to sort of track and trace software, the delivery of software, like you would track and trace any other consumer good. So I think the metrics and the control are things, there's often a lot of fear and doubt at that level. Ooh, we're embarking on a transformation, everything's going to be different. Will I get fired kind of thing if it all goes wrong? And by giving people the awareness that we're not just going to rip up everything and totally change the way the company works, we're going to do that, to partially do that in a sort of transparent way, providing you with insight that starts to calm a few ruffled nerves, if you like.
Got it. So let me and thanks for that answer, Andrew. Let me turn to sort of what I consider the forgotten foot soldiers of DevOps, mid-level managers, right? We talk about executive leadership leading the transformation. We talk about bottom-up adoption of DevOps patterns. Gary and Tommy, first of all, where do the mid-level managers fit into this equation? And then secondly, how can they effectively engage their superiors, their senior execs, to embrace and own the transformation? Gary?
I guess I would start with how they get the senior level executives to embrace it is start with the business objectives and start showing how it's going to work. But I do think that engaging the middle level of management is key, and it's what typically gets messed up in most large-scale transformations is you don't realize the importance and the value that they're providing, and you don't engage them in the process. So when Tommy and I talk about our executive-led continuous improvement process, that's the executives through their entire management and technical change leading the transformation. And once you set objectives, the manager's role is to be out in the organization playing a role of investigative reporters, trying to figure out the things that we agreed at the beginning of the iteration that we thought we could get done and we thought were important that aren't getting done. Why aren't they getting done? And it isn't why aren't they getting done to beat somebody up, but it's why aren't they getting done? What's gotten in the way of the organization being successful? So their role really becomes that of getting out of the organization, understanding what the barriers are to the effectiveness of the organization, and working with the executive team to prioritize getting those fixed for the organization so they can move faster and faster as they go through the transformation.
Excellent. Tommy, any thoughts?
Yeah, just quickly, one of the things is to be able to tie the the business objectives that we've talked about, right? So going through this transformation, presumably, an executive will agree to go down this path because they think there is business value associated with that. What oftentimes, especially if you have non-technical executive management, is they don't know how to connect the dots between the technology transformation that's taking place and those business objectives. So coming up with a set of metrics that they can look at every day and know that progress on a particular metrics translates into a certain number of dollars for them, right? That's something that they can grab hold of. And then as Gary said, right, if you're not making the progress that you want on a particular objective that you have for this iteration, making sure that your executives don't go out and start beating people up for not making the progress they want, but rather ask the question, what were the problems and the issues that got in your way, and what can I as an executive do to help resolve those things so that you can make progress?
Great advice. Great advice. I wish we had more. I'm going to wind up doing a webinar one day on the role of mid-level executives in DevOps, because it's something we could probably spend some time really digging in. But in the interest of time, we're going to move on to what we see as some of the cultural challenges here in leading the transformation. And Tommy, I'm going to start off with a question for you, which is, what are your thoughts on retaining ops and test-centric folks to become software engineers versus hiring additional software engineer staff, SE staff?
Yeah, and it's hard to come up with an answer to that at a very high level like this, right? So in general, right, my personal philosophy, right, this is just Tommy's opinion here, is I like to know that the place that I work and the people that work for me have a sense of family and security with that. And so if you get into a habit of, let's change and do this for a while and throwing out, a bunch of people, ops and test-centric stuff, you're going to create a culture that's going to be difficult for your organization to be willing to make changes, because they now have a history that says change can be dangerous. So in general, right, I don't think you want that to be your initial process to say, okay, I need software engineers, therefore I'm going to get rid of these people and go hire new ones. But ultimately, I think it always comes down to the individual, right? You've got somebody who is a quality engineer or somebody who's working in ops, and you need less of that for whatever reason at this point in your transformation. It really comes down to the individual, because in my experience, a good quality engineer who understands what the transformation is and why you're doing it is highly motivated, and as a good engineer, they'll make that jump for you and be able to do that work. Now, you may have to train them up, you may have to partner with them with an experienced software engineer, but in other cases, you have individuals that, maybe they're just at the point in their career where, they're not willing to learn a new skill set, right? And at that point, you may have to move on at that. But I guess my message ultimately is, I think you have to look at each individual and working with them determine what's the right thing to do here.
I think that's fair, and I think so much is dependent on a case-by-case basis. We're dealing with people here, right?
Exactly.
And individuals. Just before we move on, Tom, Gary or Andrew, any further comments to that? No? Okay. So our next question is a rather big topic. How to convince management and operations to accept higher risk of breaking down production due to frequent deployment of changes. And this is always a tricky one. If it's okay, I'd like to start with Andrew on this.
Well, how much time do I have? Thanks, Alan. Well, I think that one of the biggest and perhaps most counterintuitive lessons we're seeing so far from this kind of transformation is that actually, if you manage to get it right, the quality of software and the risk associated with releases goes down. And of course, the immediate question is, well, wait a minute, how can we square the circle? We're trying to release faster and we try to do it sort of better at the same time. Surely that doesn't work. And I mean, the secret seems to be that we're making smaller releases. I think one of the things that I've seen most often is that there is a sort of a preconceived notion of what a release is, because we've all lived through the 3-week endless conference calls going on 24 hours a day, lots of cups of coffee, all kinds of terrible things, and that's kind of got stuck in the IT's collective unconscious as this is the release, like it's the big thing. For most organizations, and actually this bleeds into a little bit the last question, what about those middle managers who come through release management? Yeah, they are going to have to some extent, rethink what some of the concepts mean. So if you can get to the point that you can conceive of a release as making a small change, moving an icon from the left to the right or something like that, in most organizations that would never be conceived of as a release because it's just far too small. You can't do that. So I think in terms of convincing, getting that, the first statement you have to make if you try to have this argument is the way we are going to reduce the risk is by making smaller releases. And there's interesting data to back it up, but I don't think many people would disagree with the fact that one of the biggest reasons for big production failures is that you're changing lots and lots of things at the same time, and it becomes much harder to oversee all the potential interactions. So by reducing the size of releases, we are massively reducing the kind of the risk of unexpected interactions. And that's why we need this transformation, because given the current process most organizations have, it's simply not possible to run small releases. There's too much stuff that needs to be pushed out there. There's too much fixed overhead in terms of committees and meetings and booking test environments and all kinds of things like that. And this is where, what Gary and Tommy were saying, this is where the investigative journalists on the floor asking about what is it that's causing us to not be able to release faster than once every 4 weeks? What are the steps in the process that are taking long? What keeps breaking? What can we do to get this down? Then you can present it not as, well, we're going to try and switch on this kind of rocket ship and just crash everything straight into production, which clearly sounds scary. You present it as actually a risk reduction initiative by making the organization, or putting the organization in the position where they can make small releases.
I think the other thing I'd add there is there's something associated with the smaller release batches. It gets less risky, so you can do it more successfully. But the other part of this is by doing the things that Andrew talked about, where you have enabling the increased frequency, you're going through and fixing issues that have been plaguing your organization for years, if not decades, and you're fixing them through automation and standardization and automated testing and automated deployments and automated environment definitions that drive the consistency that enable you to do that. And then by doing those things, you're making releases less risky and more stable. And so the whole idea that you need to convince people that it's okay that, you know, DevOps just means that dev can run crazy and shove whatever they want out into production is wrong. It's a structured approach where dev and ops work together to make sure all the operational issues are being addressed real time on trunk, and people are keeping the code base much more closer to stable. And then you have coordinated processes. You're using the same process in dev that you're going to be using to deploy and define environments in production. So you're solving all those issues real time, so it's easier to go out. So I think that this is a way to increase the quality and stability of deployments, not as permission to let them go less stable and unproductive and have an impact on the business.
Sure. Excellent, excellent points, guys. You know what, I'm going to need to move us along. I apologize, but it's never enough time on these things. My next question in this interactive panel is for Tommy, and that is, Tommy, we have so many groups that work in silos, more than just dev and ops. There are silos within silos. How can we break them down? How do we break these walls down? What's the ideal makeup in your mind for the, you know, perfect DevOps team?
Yeah, so really, you know, two different questions going, you know, here that are interrelated. But, you know, the first one about, you know, the silos, and I would add to that oftentimes that's more complex than is even presented here in this question. Not only do you have these independent silos, or as you said, silos within silos, but oftentimes in a large enterprise, you have parts of the organization, one set of silos that has determined that it's time to start going through this transformation. And so they begin working on that. And then you have another part of the organization which has not yet made that commitment. And so you end up with one group that is some distance down the path in terms of getting this transformation in place, getting automation in place, continuous integration, et cetera. And you have another one that's still operating under very much an old waterfall type model, right? And now all of a sudden, how do you get those things to come together on that, right? So very complex thing. My answer to that is to some extent to repeat some of the things that we've already talked about. First of all, recognize that this is an organizational change management problem. And it's not just purely a technology question that we're trying to answer here. So again, go educate yourself in that space. But then secondly, and part of change management is all around shared objectives and shared goals. And now the importance of having executives at the right level engaged, right? So, you know, all silos eventually come together somewhere, right? So when you have two silos that are struggling to work together, what you really need is the executive level sitting on top of them who's willing to engage at the appropriate level to say, okay, during this iteration or this window of time, here are the things that we're going to do. And they can jointly talk with their staffs, right, and bring them together to review the results of that. And as soon as those two sets of staffs from the different silos see that their managers above them are working together and have a common set of goals and objectives, the engineers and the first and second level managers will begin to work together as well from that. So I think the silo question is all around shared objectives and goals, but it's not enough to just put that on a piece of paper and send it out in an email or something, say, hey, these are our goals, right? Those executives have to engage and demonstrate that this is a shared objective and that we want our teams to work together. So let me stop there. Gary or Andrew, other comments about that before I go on to the DevOps portion?
No, I'd agree with that a lot. I think the other piece that I would add is a continuous delivery pipeline and I don't care who develops or who puts it together, but if you get a well-defined continuous delivery pipeline in an operational environment you possibly could, where you're moving through stages of testing and integrating more of the automated test, or more of the enterprise application as you move forward down the pipeline, you'll find that the code is a forcing function that aligns the organization and starts to break down those silos, whether it's silos across development groups or silos across development and operations, where you've got a common deployment pipeline that's defined with code. You'll find that the code that defines your deployment instructions, your environment instruction, is a forcing function that will align dev and operations. So the value of that is probably also key.
Yeah, and if I just to add to that, I mean, I think a very important point Gary just made. One of the things that I've certainly experienced many times is if the tooling or the visibility that you have in what you're doing is restricted to your own quote-unquote domain or your own silo, you don't really care what happens once the stuff leaves your frame of reference. Like a classic example, if you're a developer and the only tool you're used to using as a tracking tool is your issue tracker, where you are assigned a task to code it up, and for your purposes the issue is done once you've written the code, sure, you don't really care how long it takes from the moment the code is written to the moment it actually goes live before somebody can use it. That could be 6 months, it could be never. And that, of course, makes it very hard to even start asking the question, well, wait a minute, what's the point of me speeding up here by a day if it takes another 6 months for the stuff to go live? So to that extent, having tooling and visibility that blinkers you also makes it hard for you to see where the problem is once you start to realize that this end-to-end process suffers a lot of bottlenecks, errors, all kinds of things. People are generally smart, so they look at this and they say, well, wait a minute, surely we can do better here, but you have to show them that that's what's going on. I think that's especially relevant in perhaps the most siloed case of all, which is where you've outsourced like a bunch of stuff. I mean, a very extreme version of this question. I'd be interested to see what Tommy or have to say about that, or Gary. If you have both outsourced development and you've outsourced the running of, for instance, your production environment, that typically means that you're basically living in a wealth of change tickets to get anything done. And I think it's a very interesting question as to what extent you can DevOps size such a kind of setup, if you like. But I've had some very interesting discussions with people who've tried to make this work in this scenario, where they've done things like try to agree with their software suppliers that part of the payment, part of the incentive is not just to deliver the code, but to actually get it live. And of course that's difficult because to some extent they're not responsible for that. But on most organizations that are good examples of DevOps or continuous delivery, there is shared responsibility and ownership across the chain of the idea that we all have to work to do to get this code live together.
Excellent. Let me move on to the next question, guys, because time's an issue. Gary, we talk about the whole pie, right, in terms of, how do we manage change for people who want to eat the whole pie immediately? So they want to, they don't want to go through the steps. They just want to get, to that whole pie. Gary, why don't you take a first crack at that one?
What I do when I work with organizations on this is we do a workshop, and we really come in and we get a one-day workshop, and we go through the front end to the back end of their development processes and delivery processes, and we try to identify all the things that are broken or that they would like to do better, and you get a long list of it, and at the end of it you get that down to, here are the top priority things that we as an organization feel like will have the biggest impact on our business and help us the best. And then we break that down into things that they think they can get done that month. And you assign names, and you assign people, and you assign that. And then you drive like crazy to get that done for the first month. And what I find is organizations that think they can get it all done at once, that quickly starts to fall apart month by month as they sign up for way more than they can get done. So that's typically the process that I use with organizations is, let's not talk about the whole thing, let's not talk about a 4-year plan, let's talk about what's most broken, and let's agree what we can get fixed this month. And then the management chain plays the role of investigative reporters, figuring out what got done and what didn't get done and why. And at the end of that month, you'll typically see a lot of organizations come back and get about 50% of what they thought they could have gotten done. And they'll struggle and they'll understand some things that are in the way and they'll prioritize some other things, and maybe next time they get 80%. But it's more of a holding people accountable by holding a checkpoint at the end of the month to really figure out what didn't get done. And that process of them coming to the realization over time that even given everything that they've tried to do, they're not getting it all done, that will force them to prioritize and filter back the list of what they're trying to get to.
You know, guys, and if I can just interject quickly, Gary, I've read the book, as you know, and in both in the book and in my own work experience, I find that executives who are trying to lead transformations are much more effective when, whether we call it the whole pile or boiling the ocean, they understand that incremental progress is progress. Very rarely do we see that, one lightning bolt of where, everything gets done at once. You realize all your goals the first time through. And I think that's probably the sign of maybe a seasoned executive, to understand he takes his win, or he or she takes their wins as they come and builds on them. So I think that is an important point to be made, especially when you're talking to executives, as you and Tommy do, Gary, about how to lead this transformation, how to make it happen.
Yeah,
Next question.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. Do you want to comment?
No, go ahead. We've got a lot more good questions to get to.
I know. I apologize. For companies who currently test at several levels and with independent teams, how do you assure that nothing gets missed? So in other words, how do we make sure the overlap covers everything we need? Tommy, why don't you take first crack at that?
Sure. The very first thing that comes to mind is, as an executive, I'd be leery if somebody came to me and said, hey, I've got a test methodology and nothing's going to get missed, right? So if you're working in an enterprise software environment, there's always things that gets missed. We simply don't have the time, the money, or the computing power to exhaustively test everything. So first of all, I don't know that you can give them absolute assurance of that, but there are certainly some things that you can do to substantially reduce the risk, right? So in the context of this question, right, you have different teams independently testing and at different levels of that testing. One of the things that you can do, though, is to ensure that someone in the organization at the appropriate level, right, has an overall test strategy in place. In other words, what are each of these independent teams doing? What testing are they providing, and at what level, right? So as we move from code reviews to unit level testing all the way to fully integrated system level testing, right? Ensuring that we're doing the appropriate amount of each of those types of testing, and that each of those teams understands that they are covering a portion of the overall test strategy. And with that well-coordinated strategy, all right, so now you've got some test or quality architect type person sitting on top of that, ensuring that those plans are in place. And oftentimes in our siloed worlds, right, those teams are not accustomed to working in a coordinated fashion like that, right? So that leads us back to our need for executive involvement, and for that executive to say, hey, I want to see that strategy, right? And then be able to prioritize that work for the individual team so that they know they're contributing to that larger strategy.
Excellent. Andrew, or actually Tommy answered. Gary or Andrew, any further comments to that one? No?
Gary, you want to go first?
No, go ahead, Andrew.
Well, I think the thing about, the most important thing I think Tommy said, and is the same thing, is that, first of all, anybody who says, well, we can't test everything, that comes back, actually aligns with the point I was trying to make a little bit earlier. That reminds me very much of one of those, we're going to release a air traffic control system or a nuclear power plant control setup, and everything has to be tested because otherwise really bad stuff will happen. And I sincerely hope for those kind of applications that is exactly the way it works. But of course the vast majority of applications that we write out there are not in any way related to those kinds of systems in terms of the amount of assurance that we need. And so I think we need to drop this this notion that we need 100,000 trillion million % assurance that everything has been tested and everything will work exactly as expected. Because A, we know that that's not true. I mean, it's not as though that's the world we live in right now, after all. And B, one of the things this transformation does is it puts you in a position, A, to make smaller changes so there's less to test. Hopefully more regression testing in general to make sure you haven't broken the system with your change than trying to test 500 new pieces of functionality. And I think the other thing is smaller releases in general and the types of technologies that are usually used and also make it easier to go back. Now that's not necessarily advocating for a world where we just throw garbage into production and then just wait to see what happens. But we do realize that we are putting ourselves into a position where we can think about the production deployments more as small experiments that we can revert more easily if things didn't quite go the way we wanted to. For instance, we may even try the experiment out on a small subset of our overall target environment. So it's more about accepting the fact that we are never going to get 100% perfection in most software, and for most software that's not even necessary. And thinking about, you can invest the same dollar in additional testing, you can also invest in better remediation. So not that one is better than the other, but it's a trade-off that organizations, I think, need to think about.
Excellent. Guys, I'm going to move us along here quickly, though, if it's okay. And Gary, I'm going to come to you with this question and then ask Andrew, excuse me, to follow up. It's fundamentally, can a DevOps transformation be an IT-only transformation, or by definition, does it need to be a full-on business transformation that includes other functions besides IT or in addition to IT? Gary, I'm going to ask you first, if it's okay.
Yeah, ideally you want your business partners to come with you because they have some influence on the priorities of the organization and they want to be involved. That said, sometimes it's hard to get them fully engaged in it, but even if you can, and this is the role the executives need to play, is they need to make sure that on the business side they at least understand that a certain percentage of your capacity needs to be going to sharpen the saw. All too often, if it's business and business driven only, they will focus so much on cutting with the saw that the saw will get so dull that you can't cut very fast. And I think it's the role of the software managers of the IT organizations to really engage with the business and help them understand that a certain percentage of our capacity should be committed to sharpening the saw, improving our processes, improving our effectiveness, and philosophically get that alignment, and then ideally bring them to your checkpoints where you're showing the things that you've fixed, the things that you've resolved, so that they can see things getting better and they can see where that investment's going and how it's helping them and how it's helping the business. So ideally you want them involved. Without their involvement in the day-to-day ongoing, I still think you can make some progress, but you need to be, the executives need to be able to carve off a certain percentage of their capacity to focus on the continuous improvement of the process, as opposed to just spending all the 110% of the capacity just delivering the latest business feature.
Fair enough. Andrew, any comments?
I think Gary has covered most of the things that I was going to say. I mean, I think that for now, just looking at what we're seeing out there, it's definitely the case that a lot of the initiatives, especially the ones at the bottom up, are pretty technical. And I think the one interesting part, the sort of maybe a little bit of a dark secret, is that discussions I've had that sort of, well, initially they surprised me. Now I've kind of grown used to them. Is that in quite a few cases, much as the business likes to complain, the business, the marketing people or whoever it is who's throwing the requirements over, much as a lot of them like to complain about the fact that the stuff they're getting is late and it's not what they wanted and so on, they're also quite happy with a way of working where they can just not have to talk to IT for 6 months at a time. And if you have that conversation with them saying, yeah, sure, we're going to move to a much more reactive, iterative model, but you have to be part of that iterative cycle. Like, you have to be willing to commit the resources to actually keep track of what's going on, because we'll be needing your input on a much more regular basis. you can initially get some sort of pushback to say, you know what, why don't just go figure it out, people. And of course, that's just wrong. And we have to, that's nice from a technologist perspective to get the invitation, just go play. But we're not going to achieve business goals if we do this. And this is where the executive leadership is very critical, because that gives you the kind of firepower to have what's potentially a kind of tricky conversation to say, okay, do you realize that you can't just draw up a business requirements document and then just like not comment for months? Like, that just doesn't work. You're going to have to figure out a way to make these resources much more available so that we can have that ongoing dialogue that is at the heart of this whole continuous delivery process.
I think one of the challenges out there is software is so unlike anything else they manage in the business. And what Tommy and I tried to do in Chapter 5 is highlight the differences in software and why it's important to manage it differently than you manage everything else. And hopefully that is a quick 10 pages that you can hand to the business side and get them to read it, and hopefully it's enough to get them to think differently about managing software.
Fair enough. Guys, we're going to just move along at this point, though, and I want to jump into tools. And just a question or two here. Andrew, we'll lead off with you. What criteria do you think we should use for selecting DevOps tools?
Oh, it's an entire PhD thesis in its own right there. I think the things to, and I think there's some slides somewhere online that go into this in much more detail. Obviously, we'll want to try and keep it short here. The things to bear in mind, certainly from our experience, one is applicability across multiple different teams. Sure, every organization has a couple of teams where you've got the people who can make any kind of technology work. But the point is that if you're going to try and do this broad spectrum, then you're going to have a bunch of people who are not on the Tiger team. So don't necessarily only look at tools that require, if you like, a super IT specialist sort of brain and motivation to get them to work. I won't name the tool, but I saw a nice slide recently where somebody said, this tool, great tool, but requires a PhD. Now, for me, that is basically a disqualifier to use that in a large-scale setting. I think the other things are, and this is especially relevant, if you like, if your tool choice is coming heavily from an IT angle, think about the fact that it's not just about automation. A lot of the IT-driven tool selection processes I've seen go into incredible detail about, can you call this particular other tool with this particular command line flag at this particular time of the day or night or whatever. And they largely ignore the aspects of visibility and control that are going to be necessary to interface with that part of your organization that's actually benefiting and ultimately paying for this stuff to happen. And what does that mean in practice? Well, it boils down to the sort of somewhat more boring things like reporting functionality, things like dashboarding capabilities. Can you send someone who's not a technician to the tool, and can they get useful information out of it? Can I export the data out of that kind of tool? So I think those are questions that really should be asked in your own evaluation process. And I think another thing that's worth bearing in mind is it's a very complex tool space. There's lots and lots of different types of tools. I know maybe that's one of the reasons our DevOps periodic table of elements was so popular, is just because people have so much difficulty trying to categorize all the millions, trillions of different types of tools, all claiming to do the same thing. I think what's important is develop a bit of an understanding of those categories, and also you will see quite quickly that some of the categories are are almost commoditized now. There's a couple of market leaders. You can pick one, you can pick both. It's not worth investing a huge amount of time doing bake-offs in commodity areas, because you're pretty much safe with whichever one you choose. There's other areas that are much more bleeding edge, basically the entire containerization space right now, for instance. Lots of interesting work going on there, but nobody's sure at this point which of the tools will win out, which of the frameworks will stay, which of them will go. So that's, if you're going to make choices, either shy away from that kind of fast-moving area totally, or be very aware that you will need to investigate in much more detail whether you can get the kind of support you need, whether you have the kind of expertise in-house, and so on, to make that work across the company.
Okay.
I think the other one I'll add real quick to that is, as much as possible, if you can let the team pick, they'll make their ideas successful, as opposed to forcing it on them. but you don't want to spend forever on the picking process either. I agree with Andrew. There's a lot of good tools out there, but each of them are going to have quirks that some people may be a little bit annoyed with. But if they were their choice and their quirks, they'll make them work. If they were forced on them, they'll get mad about the quirks and get frustrated.
Fair enough. Guys, I'm going to ask one last question of our panel, and then I'd like to take, because we have a bunch of questions from the audience. And so this one is on continuous delivery, and we could start with Andrew if it's comfortable, or Tommy. We haven't heard from you in a bit now. What impact does DevOps and continuous delivery have on the traditional practices and tools that are used by ops and service management?
Andrew, you want to take a shot at that one first?
Okay, let me be very quick and say I think this is quite related to the middle manager discussion we were having earlier. So this kind of area, I mean, it's difficult to know exactly what the question means. If we're talking about traditional like ITIL type change management, release management processes, or Six Sigma type stuff, or all these sort of standards that have been established, I think that is definitely an area where we will see some change in the way people see their roles, change in the kind of controls that they're used to enacting, and also maybe a change of mindset in what, release managers, for instance, quite often see their role as being a gatekeeper, and I don't think that's necessarily compatible with the kind of process that we're talking about here, where, as Tommy and Gary were saying earlier, we should be thinking in terms of enablers more than gatekeepers. Now, the good thing is that, of course, in most organizations, the silent majority of people is always willing to change and do things better. And there will be some who, they see fear as soon as they see their treasured position being able to chair this weekly meeting where they say do or die to change requests. Yeah, that may go away. And then you, of course, you have to ask yourself whether that kind of mentality is really what you want for this transformation in general. But I think there's, we shouldn't. The important thing is to remember that all these processes we put in place were put in place ultimately to try to achieve a business value. No business exists so that you can have an ITIL compliant change management process. And if the ITIL compliant change management process does not serve the needs of the business, then it needs to be modified. Luckily, all these frameworks were actually very flexible. They were usually implemented in a very rigid way, but all of them quite obviously said the same thing. Like, you have to adapt this process to make sense for your business. And I think we should not be afraid to take up their offer, if you like, and ask ourselves, okay, how do we do release management today? How can we improve it? And that can be done in a fully spec compliant way, if you like. You don't have to be worried about offending the ITIL gods.
Okay. Gary, Tommy, any follow-on to that?
Sorry, this is Tom. Just, quickly, one of the things that we alluded to earlier is, in an ideal situation, what you want is your entire enterprise organization making a transition, right? All the way from your requirements generation and documentation all the way through development, qualification, and delivery into production, right? You would like all aspects of that system to move to a more agile type process. And if you're fortunate enough to be in that situation, then what impact does this have to DevOps continuous delivery to those traditional practices? Well, those traditional practices are likely going to change. But like Andrew said, oftentimes the tools that we have in place are capable of being very flexible, right? We have a tendency to implement our usage of those tools in a somewhat rigid way, but oftentimes the tools have the flexibility to do more. So as you find yourself at that particular point in the transition, you can always look at your tools. It really comes down to, are those individual teams, traditional ops for instance, willing to start changing their processes to be more agile in what they do?
Excellent. Excellent. Guys, we only have about 5 minutes and we have a bunch of questions. So let me say that if we don't get to everyone's questions, we do have them in writing, which is another good thing about using the control panel. We'll get them to our panelists and we'll try to get them out. Excuse me, we'll try to get them out up on the website along with the recording of today's show. But first, and Andrew, you might have actually hit on this in your last answer. In the absence of good infrastructure, How can we implement CD transformations?
In the absence of good infrastructure. First of all, I think infrastructure may or may not be the bottleneck that you have. That's part of starting on the CD thing, is to ask yourself, what is the biggest problem we have? If the infrastructure is the problem, yeah, you're clearly not, you're going to have a hard time of getting beyond the limitations that your infrastructure imposes. And then the argument becomes, well, is that limitation acceptable? Okay, maybe we can only release once a month because, you know, there's only one test environment and it takes a month to set up or whatever. Then, yeah, then if it once a month is good enough, okay. If it's not good enough, then that's where you get back to that executive discussion with the business. We want to go to once a week. We can't because our infrastructure is broken. What do we do about it? And yeah, there are very few cases where infrastructure is unfixable. It's physical, you know, like the laws of physics prevent it from happening. Often it's a question of money. And then it's back to, well, what's the business case? What are we going to get out of it? Is it worth making the investment?
Excellent.
You know, it's interesting. Sometimes people think infrastructure and they think environments aren't good. Some of the environment issues are quick and easy to fix. Tommy had some experiences on fixing those in previous experience, and we got those fixed reasonably quick, but what we found is people still felt like it was the infrastructure environment issues, when in reality it was the code from all the different independent teams that wasn't working well and integrating well together. So part of it may truly be infrastructure, but part of it may be making sure that you're integrating and keeping your code quality up on a day-to-day basis.
Great. Next question. How do we bring DevOps into Q&A? What are the tools that facilitate this? Anybody?
DevOps to QA?
Yes, DevOps and QA.
At QA, you absolutely need to be automating all your tests and put them as close to developers as you possibly can to where they're responding and reacting to those test failures on an hourly basis. That is one of the biggest breakthroughs. I can't imagine how you would transform your software development processes without a huge amount of test automation. And that's the role that the quality, and it probably needs to be quality engineering organization needs to be playing.
Yeah, I think one of the big, just very quickly, one of the bigger ones that the bigger wins in this area I've seen is to not regard QA as the activity to be performed after the development is done. QA is an activity that runs alongside development in an iterative fashion, so that you start having, it could be tooling, I mean, it could be just better use of Jira or whatever. It can be make it more visible in the pipeline, which features are in there, which can be tested. But ultimately, you know, get the person who's responsible for testing a particular feature talking to the developer who's building it. It's perhaps the simplest possible thing that I can imagine that, you know, creates a better understanding and integration and a more DevOps-like way of thinking from a test perspective.
Absolutely. Next question. What tools do you recommend that can provide the track and trace visibility for executives? Tommy or Gary, why don't you take first crack at this one?
Oh, I was going to point at Andrew because I have a great tool that helps in this space that my teams have used in the past. In other cases, we've built custom dashboards, if you will, right? So if you are in an organization that has a fully integrated system, not a plug for anybody here, but if you're using HP Quality Center, for instance, right? You already have a tool that has requirements, test results, defects, etc., all fully integrated together. It has its own reporting capabilities. You can build a front end on top of that if you want. If you're in an organization that has all those things spread out, right? So if you use Jira or Mingle and version 1 and name your favorite set of tools out there, and that data is not integrated, then either you have to, via going in through the APIs, pull that data out and house it yourself, or there are tools out there that will do that for you. But at the end of the day, what you have to find out is what are the set of metrics that are important to your executives and your management staff. And in many cases, that's the type of things that I've already mentioned: your test results, your defect counts, your how many stories are opened and closed, and all those kinds of things. And in other cases, you have to show that type of data, but to your executives in a way that they can make the jump to the business value that they're seeing with those results. So without plugging in a whole lot of specific tools, there are some tools out there that will help pull that stuff together for you. And in other cases, I've been in organizations, Gary and I have, where we've built our own tools because we couldn't find exactly what we needed.
Yep. Guys, we're past the hour, so I'm just going to go just one last question. It's an easy one for Gary or Tommy. Someone wants to know what exactly was the name of the new book. Gary?
No.
Leading the Transformation, Applying DevOps or Agile and DevOps Principles at Scale.
And it's available on Amazon and through IT Revolution, correct?
Yes, it is.
Yep,
Bulk orders through IT Revolution, individual orders through Amazon, and it's a quick, easy read. It's about 100 pages. It's not overly technical, so I think you can hand it to your business side. You can hand it to other places. The first 2 chapters are available, and for $12 a piece, if you order them in bulk, it's something that you could pass out in your organization. At least get common terminology, common thought processes. The tweet yesterday, it was somebody just finished reading it and it was like tweeted out that everybody should figure out how to get their bosses to read the book. So I don't know if that works for you, but at least it's a common thought process and a common approach.
Yep. And as you mentioned, we do have the first 2 chapters available up on DevOps.com, so anyone can download it from there. Guys, unfortunately, we're going to need to pull the plug because we're almost 5 minutes past the hour. These sort of formats lend themselves, we could probably talk all day, and maybe we'll come back and do it another time and finish our conversation. But until then, Gary Gruver and Tommy Mouser for a great job on the book, and I know it's doing well out in the market. Thank you. Andrew Phillips, always a pleasure to have your intelligence shining through on these webinars. So thank you for attending. Thank XebiaLabs for sponsoring today's webinar, and thank all of our listeners who dialed in today or logged on today to listen to this. And we will be posting the rest of the questions in written format with answers within the next couple days up on the site. This is Alan Schimmel for DevOps.com, and thank you very much for joining us today.